All right, hello and welcome to round two of the US Amateur Team East. As we saw in the previous video, we were entering this round with a victory over a 2250 player in round one, and our team had made a 4-0 score, so as good a start as you can possibly hope for. But as we talked about last time, the accelerated pairings mean that we are playing quite strong teams from the beginning, and so in round two, we were faced off against a fairly strong FIDE master, Dmitry Volkov. We played once in this event a few years prior. I had the black pieces at the time, and we drew the game actually fairly quickly. I equalized nicely, or not quite equalized nicely out of a Petrov, which I was playing at the time, but my opponent offered a draw in a very, very slightly better position, and I saw no reason not to accept with black. But this time we had the white pieces, so we were certainly going to be playing for a victory, especially given this is a team event and we're sort of obligated to make a very, very big score as board one, especially with the white pieces. So in this game, I started with e4. My opponent played, as he usually does, the knight c6 variation of the Sicilian that mostly leads into the Sveshnikov after d4, takes, knight f6, knight c3, e5. Looks very anti-positional, but it turns out that this position is actually very, very solid for black. There's been a number of high-level encounters over the years. And in fact, this variation is so solid that white has mostly abandoned playing d4 against knight c6 altogether at the highest level, and instead plays to move bishop to b5, the Rosalimo, which is what I chose in this game. And this move bishop b5 has a few sort of intentions behind it. One is just to get the bishop out of the way so we can castle quickly. Rapid development, sort of similar to the Royal Lopez. But also similar to the Royal Lopez, we're vaguely sort of brandishing the idea of taking on c6 and forcing black to double his pawns, which is a quite significant advantage in principle. White can work around the lack of the two bishops because the positions will be usually very closed, and the double pawns can be quite weak. So if black plays g6, which is one of the main lines in this position, white is usually very happy to actually just go ahead and take on c6. Ask black which way he wants to take. B takes is in some sense the most natural because it's capturing towards the center. D takes has actually been the more common choice in the modern era. And after castle bishop g7, d3, something like this, there's a large body of theory, but in general, white is considered to have a very, very comfortable position and a safe advantage. So black has been experimenting with other options in this position. e6 is also a very, very serious main line. The main modern thing to do is to play e5, which looks very, very strange at first glance. It even looks like it's giving up a pawn at first glance, but very similar to the Royal Lopez. It turns out that black has enough tactical resources after takes and queen d4 to reach a fine position if white goes for the immediate capture. And if white plays more modestly with, for example, castles, then we'll often reach positions that are extremely similar to the Royal Lopez. Remember, in the closed Royal Lopez, black is often moving this knight out of the way in order to play c5 and then bringing it back. So getting c5 in is, in some sense, an accomplishment this early. The downside is that black needs to go to some contortions to justify this configuration immediately, and often has to play this kind of ugly-looking move, bishop to d6, drop back to c7 to play d6, and so on. Magnus is a big proponent of this line as black, and in some sense e5 has actually become the main line in modern theory. But in this game my opponent chose another slightly older main line. I think nowadays is considered quite comfortable for white, but he went with the move d6, which has seen also a little bit of a resurgence in popularity recently. And the point of d6, of course, is just trying to reach like sort of the normal Sicilian positions. d6 is a very, very common move in these sort of dragon structures, accompanied with g6, trying to feign shadow the bishop. It also lends more support to e5, and it's trying to argue that this exchange actually isn't that dangerous for black, even though there's a double pawn, since black hasn't sort of slowed down with g6 and bishop g7. Black is now has a little bit accelerated development as a result of getting d6 in it early, and can play for moves like e5, f5 very quickly, and reach a very, very comfortable position. So bishop takes c6 also still remains a main line. There's a lot of theory that's developed around it, but mostly white goes ahead and castles instead. Now white is again sort of brandishing the idea of taking on c6. If black forces it, then after takes, white has a very important move, e5, which interferes with black's desired setup of playing e5, a quick f5, etc. And in this position, white is doing extremely well, even objectively. If black goes ahead and takes, then these pawns are extremely weak forever, these doubled now isolated pawns. And if not, it's not really clear what black does. For example, after bishop g4, we can simply defend the pawn again. And black is very sort of hard-pressed even to suggest how he develops his pieces at all. Black probably eventually has to play the move d5, but now this structure looks quite seriously bad. This pawn is weak. White has a number of options of how to start putting pressure on it. This sort of starts to look like a reverse Nimzo Indian, almost, but without any of the main compensation for black of having the big center. So the other point of d6 is revealed after castles, which is to play the move bishop to d7. Just defending the knight with a piece so that if white does go ahead and take, then black can take back with a piece instead of doubling the pawns, and then there's just white is giving away the two bishops for no reason. So you reach a passive position. It's kind of similar to like the Steinitz variation of the Roy Lopez with a very early d6. E4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, d6. Or a6 first and then d6. The deferred Steinitz has also been very popular recently. And the point is, after white is starting to brandish the idea of putting pressure on c6, black simply plays bishop d7 and says, okay, my position is passive, but it's very, very solid. You know, you don't really have any serious ideas to break this. So after bishop d7, which is a very similar idea, in this position I played the move c3, which continues the main line. White wants to advance with d4. My opponent played knight f6, natural development, rook e1, a6. And now white has a choice of where to put the bishop, but mostly white goes ahead and plays the move bishop to f1, which is what I played. This is part of the point of rook e1. Obviously it's to defend the pawn, but it also makes room for the bishop. Now you might wonder what the point of this bishop on f1 is, because it looks like a very strange move if you haven't seen this idea before. It's very common in these sort of bishop e5 Sicilians, but you might ask, like, why are we undeveloping our bishop? Isn't it more actively placed on a square like a4 or c4, or even d3 going to c2? And this is true. The bishop is sort of not great on f1. I mean, it's not like it really does anything there, but it does just sort of get out of the way. It's not vulnerable to harassment with b5, for example, which it would be if it went to a4 and had to go all the way back. Black would get this sort of Roy thing that he's looking for, and the bishop has wasted quite a lot of time. And on f1, it actually has an important defensive duty a lot of the time to shore up the kingside, which is particularly true after the move bishop to g4, which was played, trying to act against d4. And the point is that after d4 takes, black takes on f3. Now we're actually not so upset to take back with the pawn. If the bishop were on a4, this would be very, very weakening, because the kingside would have no defense, and that's a very, very serious concern for white. But with the bishop on f1, we're actually kind of fine with having doubled the pawns in exchange for the two bishops, because the bishop does a great job of sort of single-handedly holding down the entire kingside. And in the meantime, we have a very large center with rapid development coming. And this bishop actually has very natural home on h3 a lot of the time, where it controls what can be a very important diagonal. In particular, if black goes for something like e5, d5, looks for this sort of King's Indian type structure, but with the doubled pawns for white. Now h3 is actually a very good square for the bishop because it controls c8, meaning that white will be able to put pressure on the c-file without black being able to contest it. So in this position, you know, black played bishop g4, there's nothing really else to suggest. The bishop doesn't do anything on d7, and he needs to interfere with d4 somehow. So white has two options here. The main line is to play h3, sort of putting the question to this bishop immediately. Is he going to trade it off, or is he going to try to go back and allow a very serious pawn storm with g4? Again, by the way, this is another reason that the bishop goes to f1. It can develop to g2 after that, where it's very comfortably placed on the long diagonal. But I played the more direct attempt, d4, which is basically asking, okay, like, you tried to stop d4 by playing bishop g4, but are you really going to take on f3? Like, is this a bluff, or is this like a real thing that you're going to do? And it does mostly turn out to be a bluff. Black generally doesn't take on f3. He can, but it's not generally done. And instead, black tries to challenge the center immediately with the move d5, which also makes quite a lot of sense. The bishop on g4 basically saying, okay, like, I'm not going to take on f3 immediately, but I will later. After white plays e5, all three knight moves are kind of reasonable. I guess there's technically four, but knight h5 doesn't really make a lot of sense. And after black moves a knight anywhere, let's say g8, d7, now black really is threatening to take on f3. Because if white plays like a normal move, let's say knight c3, now after takes, if white has to take with the pawn, and black plays e6, now we get a French structure where black has gotten rid of his light square bishop, which is great, because his light square bishop is usually his only problem in the French. The structure is otherwise very, very good for black. White has doubled these f-pawns, which has two effects. First of all, it weakens white's king, which is not necessarily that big a deal, because black doesn't have a great avenue towards it. But perhaps a more important thing is that white's plan in the French is very much connected with playing f4, f5, and now that's never really possible. Because if white ever plays f4, black simply plays g6, and there's no way, because the g-pawn is sort of moved over to the f-file, there's no way to ever generate more support for the f5 move. White simply has no plan in this sort of position, and black is probably already better. So I had some preparation, of course, for both of these moves, which are by far the two main moves in the position. But in this game, my opponent played a third move, knight e4, which I actually hadn't really seriously prepared for, because it is not one of the main moves. Very much a third option. So I don't know if this was maybe my opponent just misremembered some of his theory, or this was a new position for him after the immediate d4 and not h3, or if he didn't know what he was doing and just thought that this would be a good surprise to throw in, kind of expecting that I would have prepared for the main lines. But in any case, he chose this move knight e4, and I had to spend quite a bit of time thinking here, because there's a very big question of, like, what the difference is. Like, why is it any different on e4 than it is on one of the more passive squares, d7 or g8? Like, knight e4 is a very natural move. And eventually the explanation that I came up with, I'm not sure if this is correct or not, is that after the move h3, if the knight were somewhere else on d7 or g8, then again, black would be very, very happy to take on f3. In fact, like, forcing him to take on f3 is very, very strange if this knight was back on d7 or g8. But with the knight on e4, now when we take with the pawn, the knight is actually trapped. It has no squares. Black hasn't played e6 yet, so the g5 square is not protected. And these pawns on d4 and e5 do a very good job of corralling the knight otherwise. So after h3, black is forced to move his bishop back, which is what he played. I actually thought that, I kind of expected him to move his bishop somewhere along this diagonal. I wasn't sure where. Probably d7 was my guess, just going back to where it came. But he chose h5 very quickly, which slightly surprised me, because it allows the move I played in the game after some thought, which was e6. Now, if you've never seen this idea before, this is another move that might look quite strange, because we're giving away a pawn for what exactly? You know, it's not like the previous game that we had the black pieces in the Pyrrhic, where if white played e5, e6, then white was very well poised to immediately go and recapture this pawn, which then is very sort of clear why white is sacrificing the pawn. It's not a true sacrifice, he's going to get it back. But this is a true sacrifice. After black takes, which he did, he has no other option. We're not getting this pawn back immediately. We may never get this pawn back. But what we have done by playing e6 is we prevented black from playing e6 himself. And that means that this dark square bishop is cemented in for a very, very long time. Neither of these pawns can advance very easily. And so for the cost of the pawn, we've gotten, first of all, the e5 square for the knight. We've severely hampered black's development, not just of this bishop, but because of this bishop is stuck on f8, black is also not able to castle, which means his king is weak and his rook has some serious trouble entering the game. And so in this position, I think white has like more than enough compensation for the pawn. In fact, this is extremely dangerous for black already. If white gets a couple moves to consolidate, maybe put a piece on e5, the game can very, very quickly end from here. Black needs to be very, very careful to navigate this position. And so here I played the move g4, breaking this pin and asking this bishop where it wants to go. We could have also done this last move, played g4 and then e6, but here it would be a little more viable for black not to take on e6, play a move like queen d6 instead, trying to force us to take on f7. So I chose to do it in this order. And now black has the option of playing bishop g6 or bishop f7. Bishop g6 is a little more active. It defends the knight on e4 as well, and puts the bishop on a very comfortable diagonal. But with the bishop on g6, black is not able to move the g-pawn, so there is really no hope of this bishop developing anytime soon. So my opponent played the much more passive-looking bishop f7, where now both of these bishops are terrible, terrible pieces. They're both staring into nothingness. But this bishop on f7 does defend the e6 pawn, which is important, and it stays out of the way of the dark square bishop trying to develop itself. So in this position, I spent quite a lot of time, because we have sacrificed a pawn. Like, we do have all the advantages I talked about, and objectively, I think white has a very, very strong advantage here, but it is a pawn, and a pawn is significant. If white doesn't do something sort of immediately, and black gets time to play like g6 and bishop g7, then it's not really clear why we gave it away. Like, black can even be better because he's up a pawn. So my main instinct was to play the move knight c3, trying to exchange off black's best and really only good piece. And then after takes, for example, g6, trying to develop. I spent a long time trying to look at ideas like rook b1, putting pressure on b7. After queen c7, one of the big lines I calculated was queen a4, bishop g7, knight e5, castles. And I looked at some ideas like rook takes b7, trying to get this knight. Looked at like some other ideas like trying to play c4 maybe, trying to break open the position, but none of them really seemed to work. And so eventually I decided that this simply wasn't good enough. The idea that I apparently had missed, and the reason that I should have gone for knight to c3, was white plays this very nice move h4, which you might think, okay, like white is playing h4, h5 and starting an attack, but actually this is not really the point of h4. The point of h4 is to play the move g5 and open this diagonal for the bishop to put pressure on the e6 pawn, which is a very, very common idea in not quite this type of position, but similar positions, so it's probably something I should have come up with. But it is a very subtle idea in a position where you're looking for much more violent stuff most of the time. So this I overlooked. Knight c3 probably would have been a better move. But other than knight c3, a lot of moves are viable to try to increase the advantage, and the move I played, which was knight e5 immediately, is also perfectly fine. White retains an advantage with it. Now, if black goes ahead and takes on e5, now this knight becomes very uncomfortable because we've taken away both of its good squares. And so this knight can actually start to run into some serious trouble. After g6 again trying to develop, we have the option of considering f3, trying to harass this knight. It has to go back to c5 as its only square. We can continue to harass the knight, and eventually it has to walk its way all the way back to d7, when at this point, after something like bishop d4, bishop g7, yes, black has managed to develop his bishop and castle, or prepare castling, which is great, but the rest of his pieces are terrible. The light square bishop in particular is really, really bad. It really never will have any scope because g5 is always going to be suicidal with the king castled on the king side. And there's no real way to put more pressure on e5 in any serious way. White will always be able to play queen e2, worst case, probably f4 as well. And so white gets a very, very good version of a French here. Like, yes, black is continuing to be up a pawn, but white is having all the fun. White is basically playing two pieces up. on the queen side. And so if this situation ever opens up on the queen side, black is pretty much doomed. So black can't really justify taking on e5. And instead my opponent played queen d6, which is very sensible, trying to generate some counterplay on d4. So I very quickly played bishop e3. This was something that I calculated when going for g6. Now your first reaction might be like, okay, but aren't you hanging a pawn? Like, wasn't your bishop needed to defend b2? And the answer, fortunately, is no. Black is attacking the rook on a1, which is quite unpleasant. White should do something about that, but in fact, white actually doesn't have to do something about that, because similar to some Caro-Kann type positions, white can actually ignore this threat entirely and go about his own business, trying to wreak havoc on the queen side with his king. Remember that black's king side pieces are just not participating in the game at all, so if white manages to shift the action over to the queen side, then black is going to be very, very ill prepared to try to handle it. And in this position in particular, it's actually very difficult for black to defend even one simple pawn. If the queen goes back to defend it, now there's no like immediate urgency on white's side because the rook isn't attacked. And if we just develop the knight anywhere, now these rooks are coming to two very, very powerful files, and black might simply just get checkmated, like before he has time to castle. It takes a very, very long time for black to step out of danger. And in the meantime, black's forces are getting very, very seriously harassed. So this is one way that white can sacrifice a rook and easily win the game. So my opponent instead played g6, intending bishop g7, and now I spent a ton of time. I think I spent over half an hour on this move, because the lines get very, very crazy from here. We'll see some of them. Again, knight c3 was my first instinct, trying to trade off this knight, and we reach a very similar position to before, but once again, white has to come up with this idea of h4, bishop h3, putting pressure on e6, and actually taking this bishop on f7 with the knight, which is a little unintuitive because this knight is a very, very powerful piece and this bishop is terrible. But undermining the support of e6 is even more important than that dynamic. So knight c3 objectively is probably again the best move, and one that I spent a very long time trying to make work. But again, I couldn't end up justifying it with just queenside play. And so instead I had a number of other moves I considered here. f3 was one, taking on c6 was one, knight d2 was one, taking on f7 was one. But eventually I came up with what I thought was a very good move, or a very interesting move at least, which was to move bishop to g2. And now this sort of dares black to go ahead and take on b2. Like, very, very seriously. Because now, if black takes on b2, this idea with takes and queen a4 is much less powerful, since the bishop has been committed to the king side. And in particular, black has to move queen b5, since the square is no longer covered. Now, white doesn't have time to move away the knight and bring the rooks into the game, so black is actually doing quite comfortably here. Not only has he sort of gained a move by offering this exchange of queens that white simply cannot accept, he's also already started his sort of escape plan for the king. And so after white moves the queen back, bishop g7, black is not in any serious danger, because even if white recaptures this pawn on c6, which he probably will, black is very happy to give it away and just castle out of danger. So we're really daring black to take on b2 here. And it's not really obvious what the problem is, like why not take on b2? Black could instead play bishop g7 and continue the plan with castles, which is probably what he should have ended up doing. But after bishop takes c4, black needs to be very, very careful. If we take, then we're already sort of brandishing the idea of d5 in a lot of positions. For example, takes on f7, takes, and d5 is very, very serious, trying to remove sort of all final defense of black's king. And so after bishop e4, black actually has to take with the bishop on e5, which leads to a still very complex, but ultimately close to equal position, objectively speaking. But my opponent took the bait with queen takes b2. And now I thought for a little bit more just to make sure, but I revealed the point of bishop g2, which was to take on e4 with the bishop. Again, offering a sacrifice of the rook on a1. So for the second time, you might ask, okay, why are we giving away a rook? The first sort of the most direct approach of trying to take the rook. This again fails in the same way that we've already seen. Knight takes c6. Now if black goes ahead and takes on c6, we again have queen a4, and this pawn is basically impossible to defend. If black plays rook c8, we simply take on a6 and start to harass the rook. Black can technically play king d7, but now white isn't even down that much material, and we can continue to make threats with rook c1. After rook c8, white has a number of very promising ways to continue, but the main point is that not only has white not given away that much material anymore, it's only an exchange, and these pieces are not participating, so white's basically playing with a lot more material than you would expect from being at a material deficit. But also the queen is trapped. The queen can't go anywhere. If white plays a move like queen b3 or queen c2 ever, then we can simply just go for the queen. We don't actually have to do anything super fancy. There are, other ways to continue as well. For example, bishop d3 is very powerful. Just trying to take on a6 and go after this rook. Probably the best move. But even just going after the queen is very unpleasant for black. It's not really clear how black should deal with a simple move like queen c2, because if we take the bishop d2, intending to trap the queen, takes bishop c3, picking up the rook, for example, is one option. Here we could also play knight c3 and pick up the queen immediately for the rook. It's just too much for black to seriously handle. So taking the rook is out after bishop takes e4. This leaves two options for black. Black can either take on e4 or take on e5. Now, if black takes on e5, which is by far the most challenging move, now white needs to justify his play before black goes ahead and takes this rook. So, for example, if we take back on e5, then black is actually happy to take this rook. The queen is not yet trapped because a2 needs to be defended, and this bishop is being attacked. So if we play the queen c2 idea from before, then black is actually just kind of happy to take this. Even if we do end up trapping the queen in exchange for the rook, black would not really be down material because black is already up a rook, and a pawn, for that matter. But also it's not that easy to trap the queen, because since black took on e5, now black has another escape route out. So one option for white, and one that I had considered for a little bit, was to play the move bishop takes d5 here, trying to open up the long diagonal, so that after takes, bishop d4, we don't trap the queen, it gets away, but we do open up an attack on the rook. And so after bishop takes e6, bishop takes h8, we regain the rook. White is down 3 pawns, which is a lot, but this position is not that easy for black to handle because we are hitting the bishop, and if it simply moves back, the king is still quite weak. It will be stuck in the center for probably the rest of the game. And white has like some compensation, I thought, for the 3 pawns. But I also thought this probably wasn't enough. First of all, black has some nice moves like d4, defending the bishop from afar. Black can even consider like king f7. It's not really clear if white is even generating enough play even for this, because after queen f3, king g8, we can't actually take this piece. Black is threatening the knight. Black is also threatening the bishop. So I thought black should probably be able to consolidate his material advantage in this case, which I think was correct. But I found another sort of nice idea, which is that after takes on e5, if we sacrifice the rook here, now we don't take on d5, but we instead throw in this check, which looks useless. Why have we done this? We've allowed b5 with tempo, which is a move that black maybe had wanted to play anyway. But the pawn was actually needed on b7 to defend this very critical square c6, and after queen to c2, it's a similar idea to what we've seen before. Now queen c6 is a very, very big threat, and there's simply no way for black to adequately defend this. Again, we have the option of bringing the rook to c1 to renew the threat after, for example, king d7, rook c1 is kind of devastating. And even if black manages to defend this threat, he still has to deal with the fact that now a2 is defended, and so if we defend to e5, which we can do in a number of ways, then the queen once again is legitimately trapped. So he can't take the rook here either, which means he has to take the bishop. And now in this position, this was the main thing that I had spent calculating when I was preparing bishop g2, because this doesn't look like white has any way to continue the attack. Again, black is not going to take this rook immediately. but after he is prepared to play bishop g7 in castle. And so white needs to generate something very, very quickly, or black is very, very comfortably equalizing. So knight d2 is the natural move, trying to bring pieces into the game. But after bishop g7, knight takes e4, just queen takes e5. Now black is again actually threatening this rook. But black is also ready to castle. This check on a4 no longer really does anything. If we threaten to give a check on c6, black simply walks away. And so there isn't really an obvious follow-up here. White maybe is not worse if we just sort of play, like, I don't know, bishop g5 or c5 or something, trying to interfere with castling a little bit. Maybe, like, I don't know, maybe queen b3 is possible, technically. I wasn't really sure, but in general, this didn't look very, very convincing at all. And so this was the main position that I was focused on. Bishop d4, also a very natural move, trying to defend the rook while also hitting the queen. And after queen b4, knight c3, bishop g7. Once again, I didn't see any very big follow-up here. But eventually I found, and this was a very important find, I think, this was the line that convinced me to go for bishop g2, was that after knight d2 in this position, bishop to g7, we don't take on e4, which looks like by far the most natural move, but we play knight to c4, hitting the queen. Now the queen moves back, let's say to b4, b5, doesn't really matter. And now again, it doesn't look like white has achieved anything. If we play rook b1, the queen is very happy to just continue moving. b5 is maybe even slightly more accurate to try to aim for the d5 square and offer an exchange of queens. But b4, b5 doesn't really matter. And once again, black is prepared to castle. So what does white do? White needs to do something immediate. Or black is castling and shouldn't have any problems. So we could try knight b6, which hits the rook, but the rook is just moving to d8. Like, this move doesn't really accomplish anything, or so I initially thought. But eventually I looked at this position deeper and I realized, wait, these pieces are not participating at all. White has a very nice idea here, sacrificing the queen for the rook. Drawing the king to d8, and now important because the queen is attacking this rook, we move this rook over to c1, and there's actually no defense to mate. This is a this would be a very, very nice finish. You know, white has given away, like, the house. So white has tried to sacrifice the rook, like, 3 times. White has sacrificed a pawn. White has now sacrificed a queen. And yet, black's pieces are just so terrible that there's no way to defend mate from 2 pieces. Just the knight and the rook are coordinating themselves to deliver a very, very beautiful checkmate. So at this point I realized, okay, now this is really quite serious. If black can't play bishop g7 here, then white is very, very comfortable. White can, you know, if black has to play like queen b5 immediately to try to get out of the way of knight c4, now taking on e4 is very, very comfortable. White isn't going to win the game immediately, but white has a much, much better position. Just for sort of simple play at this point. And so my opponent eventually, I'm not sure if he saw all of this or just wanted to go for something simpler or was trying to exploit my very low time at this point. Whatever his decision-making was, he ended up just taking on e4, at which point I was very, very happy, because now the complications are over. This was a very big, very, very big mess. We had to solve a lot of problems to get here. But now the complications are over, and white is just simply much better. Because after knight takes f7, we are once again sort of sacrificing the rook. We could take on h8, but now black is doing very, very well. After he recaptures the knight, I think black should have no problems here. But the final important detail that justifies this whole sequence is that we instead trap the queen with the move queen d2. Defending both pawns, so the queen has no route out. And after king takes f7, knight c3. Black is not down material. He has 2 rooks for the queen. So technically black is even up material with the extra pawn. But it's very difficult for black to coordinate his forces, and white is prepared to basically munch all of the pawns, keep his pieces very active, and white has a very, very significant advantage here. Probably not winning per se, but this is probably like a plus 0.7, plus 1 type of position. So after knight takes f7, my opponent chose to take. But now after knight d2, now the situation is clarified. White is going to regain one of his pawns. We've now sacrificed 2 pawns, both b2 and when we played e6. But white is going to recover at least one of his pawns, possibly 2, because we'll be threatening check and taking on e6. And black is still not able to comfortably complete his development. So my opponent played bishop g7, just kind of forced. You have to develop somehow. Knight takes e4. Now there's no good defense to knight g5, pick up the second pawn, and then in addition to white's dramatic lead in activity, the pieces are very well placed. White even has the structural advantage of this e7 pawn is very weak, and the material is now equal. So my opponent tried knight d8, which is a very ugly looking move. This was the first point in the game where I was truly confident that I am going to win this game. Because if knight d8 is something that has to be played, then that's like a serious admission that the position just cannot be very, very good for black, even though this does defend both pawns, which were under threat. It does hold everything together, but only temporarily, because the pieces are just not playing. So I spent a bit of my remaining time here. I played queen f3 check. I thought this would be a useful move to always throw in, because I thought king g8 was forced. It was pointed out to me after the game that king e8 is also possible, which is not something that I had registered at all. I didn't even realize this move was legal. Because it looks very strange. I mean, black is trying to get his king to safety, but it turns out the king is actually much safer on e8 than it is on g8. White is still better, but maybe not quite winning anymore. But after king g8, which I thought was forced, he played quite quickly. Now I played the move knight c5, just intending to put pressure on both of these pawns and ask black what his plan is. You know, this rook is not participating. The queen is kind of offside. This rook is technically participating, but not really either. My opponent played h6, which seems sensible. I mean, it does weaken the king side a lot, but black needs to do something, you know, or otherwise he just loses slowly. So I took advantage of this, played queen e4. King h7 is forced to defend the pawn. I played h4, intending to put more pressure on this pawn. He found queen b5, which is not a move I had seen. I actually thought I was just going to win this pawn directly. So queen b5 was actually kind of a clever defense, bringing the queen back to hold the pawn. But now here, I mean, white has like any number of options. I could take either pawn now, which would be quite comfortable. I could just continue developing or completing the development with bringing the rook into the game, either for d1, maybe c1. I could play bishop f4. I could play f4, intending f5. Like, everything is possible here. But I chose knight d3. I think this was a little inaccurate from an objective standpoint, but at this point I only had about, I think, 8 or 9 minutes remaining for a number of moves. We still had 15 moves to make to time control when we get a little bit of bonus time. So I thought knight d3 was at least just sort of a direct approach, just going for g6. It made my plan easy. And so I did see black's defense, which he found. His only real way to try to defend the position with e5. Intending after d takes e5 to play the move queen to c6, which is very nice. Otherwise, I play knight f4, pick up the g6 pawn, and black is getting mated. And so I saw that we would reach this endgame, which I thought, not obviously winning, it's equal material, but white's pieces are all better than their counterparts. This bishop on g7 is staring into a wall. This knight is clearly better than this knight that's on the back row. Our rooks are activating very, very quickly, so I thought that white should still have a very, very serious, probably winning advantage here. And one of the things that convinced me of this was the line that we'll see actually ended up happening in the game. At this point, black has to play e6 to prevent f5. I played the move rook c1, intending to bring the rook to the 7th rank and start wreaking havoc. And so black's most natural move, in my opinion, and the one that I had foreseen mostly when I played the move knight to d3, is this move h5. Trying to break down this very, very strong construction on the king side, get the f5 square for the king, and try to activate some of the pieces at least, you know, make this rook on h8 start to look like something useful. Maybe bring the knight over to f5. You know, in principle, this looks like a very, very good move, and this is the move that I had expected. But here I found a very nice solution. I think I checked it with the computer after the game, and it wasn't super impressed by it. Like, I thought this position was so good that, like, there are better ways to win. Like, it's already giving, like, +2.5, +3 advantage after a normal move like rook c7. But I found a very it was okay with what I played. It said it was still winning, and I thought it was much more direct, which is this very nice move f5. Now black is forced to capture, because if black moves the king either way back, we simply play f6 and then g5, and then these pawns are running down the board. It's a complete disaster for the black pieces. So he is forced to take, and now we take back not on f5, which is possible, probably also good, but on h5. And now the point of f5 is revealed. We gave away a pawn, but we obtained the f4 square for the knight. So the rook is not able to capture because we would then fork the king and the rook. This means that black is forced to take with the king. He could go back, but then again, the rook comes to c7, and white is very, very, very close to winning, if not just straight up winning. So he's forced to take with the king, and after knight f4 check, now the king doesn't really have a good square. If it goes to g5 or h6, it will be vulnerable to the discovered attacks. The computer actually thinks king g5 was mandatory, if I remember correctly, but this is connected with basically sacrificing a piece for not a whole lot after some move here. Actually, I think it doesn't even want to defend the bishop, because after takes, actually not quite sure what the move here is, but very, very dangerous for black. I mean, one of these discoveries is definitely working. We can cheat, I guess, a little bit. Seems like a fair position to just check what the solution is. Takes. Okay, this was my instinct. And then the king is just getting basically mated. But there's maybe, I mean, there are other ways to continue the position as well. Like, instead of rook c7, we can play rook c2, which is, as we'll see, was a very similar idea to what was played in the game. And then after takes, we... a very nice move, the computer suggesting bishop to c1. Or rook d2. I mean, rook d2 is much simpler. Now we're threatening mate and bishop to d4, picking up the rook. And if black goes to h6 with the king, then we have very, very similar ideas to the game, where this king is simply getting stuck on the h-file. So my opponent played king g4, which is the most natural move, and the move that I had expected, again, from when I played knight d3 originally. And now it looks like, first of all, it looks like black's king is in very serious danger, because we are threatening to just get the king out of the way and deliver checkmate on these two files. But if we go king f2 directly, then rook h2 forces the king back, and now black's king is actually kind of safe after the rook, for example, takes on a2. So instead, we have to get our rooks to the g and h files a different way, which I did with rook c2. This is an idea we just saw from the computer in the king g5 line. And now white is intending to play rook g2, force the king to the h file, then play king f2 when there's no check, and then simply deliver checkmate on the h file. So my opponent took on e5, which seemed like the only way to try to defend, trying to undermine the defense of the pieces. After rook g2, of course, not going to the h file, where again we play king f2, rook h1, and give mate, but instead going to f3. Now here I actually started to get a little concerned for a moment, because I hadn't really seen mate here. I just kind of assumed his king's on f3, there's got to be mate, when I was originally calculating from knight d3. But at this point, I thought, worst case, when I was calculating initially, I thought, okay, worst case I give perpetual, so I can't lose. That's good. If I go rook f2, he can't go to e4, because bishop anywhere, literally anywhere, is mate 1. Every square is covered by one of the pieces. So he has to go back. And then worst case I repeat, which I actually did once. I repeated once just to... this is a common professional tactic. When you have a repetition, you should always do it once, because you get closer to time control, you kind of psychologically annoy your opponent a little bit, and you don't lose anything because you're not risking accidentally repeating 3 times. But in this position, I used some of my remaining time, actually not that much. I think I had like 8 minutes left, and I really only used like a minute and a half. But I did find the mating idea here, which is that after rook f2 check, So it was important to, from this starting position, it's important to bring this rook to the f file. And after king g4, I could have played it immediately. I repeated once. But the mating idea is to say, okay, the problem after rook g2 is I would like to force you to the h file, but you very annoyingly have this f3 square to work with. So we can solve the problem by simply taking away the f3 square, bringing this rook to f1. And now white is threatening again, rook g2, king f2, rook h1, and there's just no adequate defense. None of these pieces have participated in the game for its entirety, and they are not any closer to doing so now. So my opponent took on f4, which is his only, I think, his only try. But after rook takes, he has to go back. If he goes forward, then we give mate in 1. So he's forced to go back. We take. He's forced to go back again, because if he goes forward, then again, we force him further forward. And then there's like any number of ways to give checkmate here. Probably the simplest is rook f2 to rook h2. So my opponent has to go back. And now, very importantly, the bishop covers the g5 square, so we're able to finally force the king to the h file, where it meets, finally, its doom. Poetically, the only remaining pieces for black are the pieces that have been stuck on the back rank the entire game, and there is no defensive checkmate here. My opponent played knight f7, because, I mean, technically this does defend checkmate for one move, but it's certainly not a serious defense, of course, and here he resigned. So overall, a tremendously complicated game, especially in the middle game where I played bishop takes e4. There was a lot to calculate. I spent a lot of time, but I was very happy to have calculated pretty much correctly, or so I thought. Computer's very happy with this game, so I was very proud of this game. My opponent is a very strong player, and this was not an easy game to win. But unfortunately, we had a bit of accidents as a team. Our second board had a very difficult game, and lost basically out of the opening. Had some reached a position where black is he with the black pieces really only had one move to survive, which is known to theory, but if you don't know the position, it's very difficult to come up with over the board, and so he didn't know it and just lost very quickly in a big upset. Our board 3 did win. But our board 4 had a heartbreaking game where, after like really cleanly outplaying his opponent the entire game with the black pieces, had a completely winning position, opponent probably about to resign any moment. But unfortunately, in time pressure, our board 4 just hung a piece in like a very sad, like literally moved a piece to a square that was defended and ended up losing the game. So already in round 2, the team... we gave up a draw in the match with a 2-2 score, despite the individual victory, which is fine. I mean, you don't really... Making a perfect score in this event is what you need to do to win the event, but it's very difficult. You don't really expect it to happen all that often. Getting one player to have a good tournament for 6 whole rounds is hard enough. Getting 4 players to simultaneously have a good tournament across 6 rounds is very difficult, and so we certainly weren't surprised at a bit of an early upset. But it does mean that, and this is another sort of unique property to team events over individual events, is that once you give away a match point, the subsequent rounds, even though you may have individually won your game, get easier. So at this point I knew, okay, I played a relatively difficult day 1 for Team East. We're talking about an event that has 350 teams, the vast majority of whom are amateur players, well under 2,000, even under 1,800. Probably most of the field is below like 1,600. Very young up-and-coming players mostly. So to get like 2 relatively strong players, like a 2250, 2300, a FIDE master, like somebody who's actually titled, is a little bit unusual for the first day. So I was very happy to individually make it out of the first day with 2-0. And I did know that the next day was going to get actually quite a bit easier, at least on paper. So I don't know if I was supposed to be happy or sad about that, but I mean, certainly sad that that means that the team had given away a point, but nevertheless, I mean, I thought we were all playing relatively well, despite the bit of an accident, and so I was relatively confident going into the next few rounds. So That's it for this game. We started off with individually a 2-0 score, which is very good. The team started with 1.5 out of 2, which is less good considering we were one of the top seeds, but certainly not a disaster. And we knew the next day we'd get some maybe easier matchups to sort of try to climb back up the standings. So we'll talk about that more next time, and I will see you all for round 3 of this Amateur Team East event.